Ethan Carter had always considered himself a man of simple tastes. As an architectural historian, his passion lay in the quiet, unassuming beauty of old buildings and the stories they held within their walls. When he purchased his modest colonial revival home in the quaint suburban neighborhood of Oakwood Estates in western Massachusetts, he thought he had found his slice of paradise. The house, with its charming symmetry and historical charm, was a perfect fit for his sensibilities. The previous owner, Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, had lived there for nearly 50 years and had sold it to him at a reasonable price, saying, "I want someone who will appreciate its character." What Mrs. Whitmore hadn't explicitly mentioned, though it was buried in the property records, was that the backyard contained the partially preserved foundation of a pre-Revolutionary War meeting house. It wasn't much to look at, just a few old stone foundations covered by soil and grass, marked by a small commemorative plaque installed by the local historical society in 1972. To Ethan, however, it was a treasure trove of history, a tangible connection to the past that he felt privileged to protect. For 3 years, Ethan lived a quiet, under-the-radar life in Oakwood Estates. He tended to his garden, worked on his research, and occasionally gave lectures at the local university. His interactions with the Homeowners Association (HOA) were minimal, limited to the occasional notice about lawn maintenance or the approved color palette for exterior paint. He had no reason to believe that his peaceful existence would soon be upended. Everything changed when Victoria Langston moved into the neighborhood. She was a striking woman in her early 50s, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair, immaculate makeup, and a wardrobe that screamed suburban chic. Her Tudor-style mansion across the street was a far cry from Ethan's modest home, and it quickly became clear that Victoria had big plans for the neighborhood. Within a month of her arrival, Victoria joined the HOA board. By the end of her 3rd month, she had maneuvered her way into the presidency. Her campaign slogan, "Preserving property values through vigilance," was plastered on flyers that appeared in every mailbox. Ethan found it slightly overbearing but didn't think much of it. He had always been the type to pick his battles, and as long as Victoria left him alone, he was content to stay out of her way. Their first encounter was benign enough. Victoria left a 20-page HOA rulebook in his mailbox, accompanied by a floral-scented note that read, "Looking forward to your compliance." Ethan chuckled at the presumptuousness of it, but didn't give it much thought. Over the next few months, their interactions were limited to her occasional comments about his lawn needing a trim or her suggestions that the shade of blue he had chosen for his front door was not quite within the approved palette. Ethan would smile, thank her for her input, and proceed to do absolutely nothing different. It was a strategy that had served him well until spring arrived. Ethan had always been fascinated by the foundation in his backyard. It was a piece of history, a relic of a time when the community gathered in the meeting house to discuss the issues of the day. He had secured approval from the local historical society to enhance the site, creating a small stone patio around the foundation, adding native plantings, and installing discreet lighting to highlight the old stones in the evening. He had even obtained a small grant to help with the preservation efforts. The Saturday he began work, measuring and marking the areas for the patio, Victoria appeared as if summoned by the sound of his measuring tape. She stood at the edge of his property, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her immaculately highlighted blonde bob. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she asked, her tone sharp and accusatory. Ethan explained his project in detail, mentioning the Historical Society's approval and showing her the permits he had obtained from the town. Victoria scanned the papers with a dismissive glance. "You didn't get HOA approval," she said, tapping her perfectly manicured nail against her clipboard. "All exterior modifications require board review. It's in the rulebook." Ethan kept his tone conversational but firm. "Actually, Victoria, I checked the bylaws thoroughly. Historical preservation projects have an exemption clause, specifically in Section 12.3. Victoria's smile tightened. That exemption was meant for the Victorian homes on Maple Street, not whatever this is, she said, gesturing vaguely at the subtle rise in his backyard where the foundation lay. "Nevertheless," Ethan replied, "it applies to any property with historical designation, which mine has. The Meeting House Foundation dates back to 1742. There's even a plaque." He pointed to the small bronze marker partially hidden by the spring grass. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. Well, that's for the board to determine. Until then, I'm issuing a cease and desist. No work is to be done until we've had our monthly meeting. She handed him an official-looking form from her clipboard. Ethan accepted it with a nod. When is the next meeting? 3 weeks from Thursday. She replied with what Ethan could only describe as satisfaction. In the meantime, please ensure that your grass doesn't exceed 3.5 inches. It's looking a bit jungle-like near your fence line. With that, she pivoted and walked away, her wedge heels somehow not sinking into his allegedly overgrown lawn. Ethan followed the proper channels. He attended the HOA meeting 3 weeks later, presenting his project with visual aids, historical documentation, and letters of support from the Massachusetts Historical Commission. The other board members seemed impressed and generally supportive. Victoria, however, managed to table the vote, citing the need for further impact studies. This continued for 2 more monthly meetings, with Victoria finding new reasons to delay approval. First, it was concern about drainage. Then, worries about nighttime lighting disturbing nocturnal wildlife. Finally, she suggested that enhancing the foundation might attract unwanted historical tourism to their exclusive community. Meanwhile, spring turned to summer, and the grant money from the Historical Society was at risk if Ethan didn't use it by August. He tried reasoning with Victoria privately, even inviting her over for coffee to discuss the historical significance of the site. "You know, Victoria," he said as they sat on his front porch, "the foundation in my backyard is one of only 3 remaining structures from the original township. The Historical Society believes it was used for community gatherings before the official town was established." Victoria sipped her coffee and looked out toward her own impeccably landscaped yard. "Ethan, I understand you're enthusiastic about old rocks, but our community has standards. Visible excavation, lighting installations, strange plants. It all affects curb appeal and ultimately property values." "But it's in my backyard," Ethan countered. "It's not visible from the street." "Today's backyard project is tomorrow's neighborhood eyesore," she replied cryptically. "Besides, I've received complaints." "From whom?" Ethan asked, genuinely surprised. Victoria tapped her nails against her coffee mug. "I'm not at liberty to say. HOA complaints are confidential." Later that day, Ethan spoke with 5 of his nearest neighbors, all of whom denied making any complaints and expressed interest in seeing the historical foundation enhanced. 2 even offered to help with the project if he got approval. Bill Rye arrived, and with it came a notice of violation from the HOA regarding Ethan's unsightly backyard archaeological dig site. The notice demanded he restore the yard to its original condition within 14 days or face daily fines. Ethan was bewildered. He hadn't even begun the project beyond some preliminary measuring and removing a few weeds from around the plaque. He called an emergency meeting with the Historical Society, who recommended he document everything and suggested they could provide legal assistance if necessary. On a sweltering Tuesday in mid-July, Ethan returned home from work to find something that still makes his blood boil when he thinks about it. There was Victoria, in his backyard, supervising 2 men operating a small backhoe. They had already dug up a significant portion of the area containing the historical foundation. Stones that had remained in place for nearly 3 centuries were now piled haphazardly beside a muddy hole. Ethan ran across his lawn, waving his arms. "Stop. What are you doing? This is private property." Victoria turned, seemingly unsurprised by his arrival. "Oh, Ethan. The board voted in an emergency session to remedy the violation ourselves, as permitted in Bylaw 21.7. Don't worry, the cost will simply be added to your HOA dues." "Emergency session? I wasn't notified." "And what violation?" "That foundation is a protected historical site." Ethan's voice was rising despite his best efforts to remain calm. "The violation is the uneven ground and the unsightly rocks. We're creating a level, properly seeded lawn space, as specified in the landscaping guidelines," Victoria replied, her tone maddeningly matter-of-fact. "Those unsightly rocks are from 1742. They're protected by state historical preservation laws." Ethan moved toward the backhoe operator. "Please, stop. You're destroying a historical landmark." The operator looked uncertainly between Victoria and Ethan. "Continue," Victoria commanded. Ethan pulled out his phone to call both the police and the Historical Society. What followed was perhaps the most satisfying 4 hours of his life, despite the devastating damage already done to the foundation. First to arrive was Officer Jenkins from the local police. Victoria immediately launched into an explanation about HOA authority and bylaws, speaking over Ethan whenever he tried to interject. "Ma'am," Officer Jenkins finally interrupted, "regardless of any homeowners association rules, this appears to be destruction of private property without the owner's consent. Did you have a court order to enter and modify Mr. Carter's property?" Victoria blinked. "We don't need a court order. The HOA agreement gives us the right of access to remedy violations." "That's not how property law works," Officer Jenkins replied. "You can issue fines according to your agreement, but you can't enter private property and make changes without either the owner's permission or a court order." While this conversation was happening, Dr. Eleanor Abernathy from the Historical Society arrived. She took one look at the displaced foundation stones and actually gasped. "This is a Category 2 historical site. Who authorized this destruction?" Victoria attempted to redirect, explaining that it was just landscaping maintenance, but Dr. Abernathy was already on her phone, taking pictures and making calls. By 6 p.m., Ethan's backyard contained 2 police officers, 3 representatives from the Historical Society, a very confused backhoe operator, and his equally bewildered colleague. Victoria, whose perfect blonde bob was now looking decidedly less perfect in the July humidity, was also there, along with a reporter and photographer from the local newspaper who had been tipped off about the historical emergency by someone at the Historical Society. "This is outrageous," Victoria declared as the reporter approached her for comment. "The HOA has clear jurisdiction over exterior home maintenance. We were simply enforcing our standards." "By destroying a pre-Revolutionary War structure?" the reporter asked, pen poised over his notepad. "It's just some old rocks," Victoria insisted. "Hardly a structure." Dr. Abernathy, overhearing this, approached with her tablet displaying the historical registry entry. "These old rocks are the remains of the third meeting house, built in 1742, and one of only 5 remaining pre-revolutionary structures in the county. Their destruction is not only a violation of local historical preservation ordinances, but potentially state law as well." The reporter was writing furiously now, and the photographer was capturing images of Victoria standing beside the destruction, her HOA clipboard still in hand. By the next morning, Victoria's actions had made the front page of the local paper with the headline, "HOA President Bulldozes Historical Landmark in Landscaping Dispute." The story was picked up by several regional news outlets, and by the end of the week, it had gone viral in preservation and architecture forums online. The consequences came swiftly. The Historical Society filed a formal complaint with the State Preservation Office. The town issued a stop work order and a significant fine to Victoria personally, not the HOA. 3 members of the HOA board resigned, citing misrepresentation of board decisions after Victoria failed to produce minutes from the supposed emergency session that authorized the demolition. But the most significant blow came from Victoria's employer. As it turned out, Victoria worked as a public relations director for a major real estate development company that prided itself on historical renovation projects. Her very public desecration of a historical site represented everything their brand opposed. She was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. 2 weeks after the incident, a special HOA meeting was called. Attendance was unprecedented, with nearly every homeowner present. Victoria arrived wearing large sunglasses despite the evening hour, flanked by a man Ethan presumed to be her husband, who looked thoroughly uncomfortable. The meeting began with the vice president announcing Victoria's resignation from the board, followed by a complete restructuring of the HOA's operational procedures. New bylaws were proposed that would require a 2/3 majority vote for any action taken against a homeowner's property, along with written notification at least 30 days in advance. When the floor opened for community comments, Ethan chose his words carefully. "What happened in my backyard wasn't just about rocks or history or even property rights," he began. "It was about one person believing their aesthetic preferences trumped everything else: the law, our community's heritage, and basic respect for private property. I hope we can use this unfortunate incident to build a more collaborative neighborhood where preservation of history, property rights, and common decency is truly valued." The room erupted in applause. Even Victoria's husband clapped briefly before catching himself. The fallout continued for months. The Historical Society worked with archaeological students from the state university to properly document and preserve what remained of the foundation. Victoria's company ultimately let her go, citing the incident as irreconcilable with our corporate values of historical stewardship. The local paper did a follow-up feature on the restoration efforts, which brought attention to other historical sites in the area. As for Victoria, she put her house on the market 3 months later. The Tudor-style mansion sold quickly, but Ethan couldn't help but notice that the new owners were far less concerned with the HOA's rules and far more interested in the history of their new home. Ethan's backyard project was eventually completed, though it took longer than he had hoped. The stone patio, native plantings, and discreet lighting now highlight the foundation, turning it into a small but significant historical site that the community can be proud of. The plaque, once hidden by overgrown grass, now stands proudly at the center of the patio, a reminder of the past and the importance of preserving it for future generations. As for Ethan, he learned that sometimes, even in the quietest of neighborhoods, the past has a way of making itself heard. And when it does, it's worth fighting for. With Victoria Langston gone and the HOA restructured, Oakwood Estates began to heal. The neighborhood, once divided by Victoria's iron-fisted rule, started to come together in ways Ethan Carter had never imagined. The incident in his backyard had become a rallying point for the community, a reminder that history and heritage were worth protecting. The new HOA board, led by a more collaborative and open-minded group of homeowners, worked to create a more inclusive and respectful environment. Ethan's backyard project, now completed, became a symbol of the neighborhood's renewed commitment to preserving its history. The stone patio, native plantings, and discreet lighting transformed the once overgrown area into a serene and educational space. The Historical Society even organized a small dedication ceremony, inviting the entire neighborhood to celebrate the preservation of the pre-Revolutionary War Meeting House Foundation. As Ethan stood in his backyard during the ceremony, surrounded by neighbors, historians, and local officials, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The fight had been long and exhausting, but it had been worth it. The foundation, once hidden and neglected, was now a source of pride for the community. But the story didn't end there. As the archaeological students from the state university continued their work on the foundation, they made a startling discovery. Beneath the stones of the meeting house, they found a hidden chamber containing a collection of artifacts from the 18th century. Among the items were handwritten letters, tools, and even a small chest filled with coins and jewelry. The discovery sent shockwaves through the historical community. The artifacts provided new insights into the lives of the people who had lived in the area before the Revolutionary War. The letters, in particular, offered a glimpse into the struggles and aspirations of the early settlers, shedding light on a period of history that had long been shrouded in mystery. Ethan, who had been closely involved with the excavation, felt a renewed sense of purpose. The foundation in his backyard was no longer just a historical site. It was a treasure trove of stories waiting to be told. He worked with the Historical Society to ensure that the artifacts were properly preserved and displayed, and he even began writing a book about the history of the meeting house and the people who had once gathered there. Just as the neighborhood was settling into its new rhythm, a new threat emerged. A large real estate development company, Horizon Properties, announced plans to build a sprawling housing complex on the outskirts of Oakwood Estates. The proposed development would require the demolition of several acres of forest, including an area that was believed to contain additional historical sites. Ethan and the Historical Society immediately sprang into action. They organized a community meeting to discuss the potential impact of the development and to strategize ways to protect the area. The new HO's board, now more attuned to the importance of historical preservation, pledged its support. The battle against Horizon Properties was fierce. The company, with its deep pockets and team of lawyers, was determined to push the project through. But Ethan and his allies were equally determined to stop them. They gathered evidence, rallied the community, and even enlisted the help of state preservation officials. The final showdown took place at a town hall meeting, where the fate of the proposed development would be decided. The room was packed with residents, historians, and representatives from Horizon Properties. The tension was palpable as both sides presented their arguments. Ethan, representing the Historical Society, spoke passionately about the importance of preserving the area's history. He presented evidence of the historical significance of the sites that would be destroyed, including maps, photographs, and testimonies from experts. He also highlighted the community's commitment to protecting its heritage, pointing to the recent preservation of the Meeting House Foundation as an example. The representatives from Horizon Properties argued that the development would bring much-needed housing and economic growth to the area. They downplayed the historical significance of the sites, claiming that the artifacts found in Ethan's backyard were an isolated case. But Ethan had one final card to play. He revealed that the Historical Society had discovered evidence of a second meeting house, similar to the one in his backyard, in the area slated for development. The discovery, made just days before the meeting, was a game-changer. The town council, swayed by the overwhelming evidence and the passionate pleas from the community, voted to deny the development permit. The room erupted in cheers as the decision was announced. Horizon Properties, realizing that they had lost the battle, quietly withdrew their plans. With the threat of development behind them, the residents of Oakwood Estates turned their attention to the future. The Historical Society, now more influential than ever, worked to secure permanent protection for the area's historical sites. They also launched an educational program to teach local students about the history of their community. Ethan's book, The Stones of Oakwood, A History of the Meeting House and Its People, was published to critical acclaim. It became a bestseller in the region and brought even more attention to the importance of historical preservation. Ethan, once a quiet architectural historian, found himself in the spotlight, giving lectures and interviews about the importance of protecting our shared heritage. The foundation in Ethan's backyard, now a fully recognized historical site, became a popular destination for historians, students, and tourists. The small stone patio, once the site of a bitter conflict, was now a place of reflection and learning. Years later, as Ethan stood in his backyard on a crisp autumn evening, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The fight to preserve the foundation had been long and difficult, but it had also been transformative. It had brought the community together, sparked a renewed interest in local history, and inspired others to take up the cause of preservation. As he looked at the plaque that now stood proudly at the center of the patio, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The foundation, once hidden and forgotten, was now a lasting legacy, a reminder of the past and a beacon for the future. Ethan's story, and the story of the Meeting House, would continue to be told for generations to come. And as long as there were people like Ethan who were willing to fight for what they believed in, the history of Oakwood Estates, and the history of countless other communities, would be preserved. In the years that followed, Oakwood Estates became a model for historical preservation. The neighborhood's success in protecting its heritage inspired other communities to take similar actions. The Historical Society, now a regional powerhouse, continued to advocate for the preservation of historical sites across the state. Ethan, though no longer in the spotlight, remained an active member of the community. He continued to write and lecture, sharing his passion for history with anyone who would listen. His backyard, once the site of a bitter conflict, became a place of peace and reflection, a testament to the power of perseverance and the importance of preserving our shared heritage. And as for Victoria Langston, she faded into obscurity. Her house in Oakwood Estates was sold, and she moved away, leaving behind a legacy of conflict and a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. But in the end, it was not Victoria's story that would be remembered. It was the story of a community that came together to protect its history, and of one man who stood up for what he believed in. It was the story of the foundation, a small, unassuming piece of history that became a symbol of hope, resilience, and the enduring power of the past. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.